Hi, everyone. This is Ana de la Cruz, and today we're going to talk about American elder care migration, the choice that many elder Americans and their families are making to seek nursing or assisted living care abroad. And this is something that I've personally experienced with my dad moving to a nursing facility in Mexico. And after doing some writing about that experience, I met John Kelly. So, John Kelly is the founder of Eldercare Global. Welcome, John. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Um, and can you introduce yourself and tell us what is Eldercare Global and a bit about your story and why you are doing this work?
Absolutely, Anna. Thank you. Well, I was living in Mexico for a little while, and my dad was in Minnesota, and he has Lewy body dementia specifically. And he was in a kind of a traditional memory care level facility in Minnesota. And I wasn't really that satisfied with the care that he was getting and started doing a lot of my own research in Mexico and then felt comfortable enough to bring him down. Um, and really was working quite well and still is as we speak now. And I've learned enough to help other families consider that same out of the box solution.
Yeah, great. So, and tell me a little bit more about what it is that you do to help families who are considering the same type of arrangement of moving their families abroad. What is your role in that process?
Sure, there's a lot of things to consider. Of course, many different pillars. So how your medical insurance would work, different things related to visas, and I think the most value is probably what I've seen with my own eyes. Facilities that I think are good, and facilities that I don't think I would recommend, like anywhere, whether that's Mexico or America. And there's a lot of information, and it's an emotional decision that a lot of families have to consider. And oftentimes they have to consider it in a relatively crisis or emergency situation, even though I hope that people give it a little bit more foresight. But yeah, I try to um, just really help people consider the best options. Sometimes that's not care migration, but I do think that people should have that option, uh, eh, you know, to consider and have all of the facts to do so.
So you're helping with the logistical matters involved in moving someone, but also selection and kind of due diligence around what kind of facility, what's available, and what's a good match for the family.
Absolutely. And, that is location dependent also. So just for example, Lake Chapala, which is Ajijic, has very good weather all year round, but somewhere like Puerto Vallarta, if somebody wants to be by the sea. So a lot of different specifics in terms of what people would want. And then, all of the details that go into that. And I help people via the phone, but also if they're very serious about it, I'll meet them there and help them in person as well.
Yeah, and I can imagine there's a lot of emotional support that goes along with that too, because people are in, as you say, kind of vulnerable situations, often have kind of hit some kind of maybe a crisis or a turning point in their care. There's some reason why they're reaching out to you. So I can imagine that's it can be emotional as well.
Absolutely.
And then I'm curious to hear more about something you said in the very beginning, which is that you weren't satisfied with the care that your father was receiving. So this really touches on something I want to get into in this conversation, which is why would people choose to leave their home country, the United States, and look for care elsewhere in Mexico, Costa Rica, Ecuador? In some cases, I think, and particularly for maybe more for Europeans, but Thailand and India, I've heard, are also popular destinations. Why are people doing this, and what are the kind of differences, the pros and cons in the type of care that you can access in other places?
Sure. Well, in my dad's situation and relative in the US, sort of standard ratios of caregivers to residents are around 8 to 1. That varies quite a bit, 8 residents to 1 caregiver. And with Lewy body and other neurodegenerative diseases, even a very qualified, compassionate caregiver, I don't think can really give what 8 residents would need. So that was sort of the starting point of trying to find something different, and that's not even getting fully yet to the costs that are associated with that. That's something that pops into people's minds when I first mention it. It's like, oh, it must just be cheaper. And I just sort of like to gently say, yes, that's of course, but that's not the full story. What I've witnessed in Mexico, um, and starting to research in Panama actually, but is just very compassionate care. Latin people just naturally respect elders. There's no walking around with a clipboard and just saying, okay, that's good, and see you later, like I kind of have seen in Minnesota and beyond in America. And then, you have kind of the basics of what health is, which is, in the sun, food is being cooked usually in these facilities instead of just heated up,
Huh?
and a lot more patience, I would say. There's just a level of, hey, we're here to serve. And if that takes a long time, that's okay. And I actually also see that with not only the caregivers, but doctors and specialists that come in for, let's just say a neurology appointment. I've witnessed with my dad firsthand that a neurologist can sit with you for an hour and a half to 2 hours instead of a half an hour time slot. So really just feels all encompassing to what health is. And I think that slowly increases the, well-being.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I noticed that too. The facility that my father moved into, which is in the Chapala area, was courtyard surrounded by rooms that residents convened together in the courtyard and ate meals together. And it was much more conducive to people socializing and being outside. Whereas the nursing facility in Washington State that he moved from, I don't think he talked to any other residents or communicated with anyone else aside from the nurses and doctors that came in. And it was very interesting and different to see that difference in how people are being cared for and the impact of being out in the sun and social, because we know that the social aspect is huge, right, for elder adults, and often they're missing out on that piece.
Absolutely. And, to add on that too, it's not only the socialization that usually occurs in facilities in Mexico, but there's a lot of nuance to that, which we'll talk more about. But one piece is that most of the time these facilities are, I would say, boutique, which, have less than 10 to 15 to 20 residents, as opposed to in the US when they have, oftentimes 50 plus. And there's just more of a sense of home. So it's, I would say, a little bit easier for people to socialize. Humanly to socialize with sort of 10 people around, as opposed to being in a kind of a bigger numbered situation. But then also outside of the facility in specific areas like Lake Chapala, San Miguel de Allende, Puerto Vallarta, there's already a very big community of Americans and Canadians that are there, that people are oftentimes kind of surprised as to the social circles that they can sort of just easily enter into outside of the facility, which I think really helps with feeling at ease at a new place.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And it makes sense why these care facilities are kind of clustered in the sort of foreigner heavy areas
Right.
of Mexico or other countries. Interesting. And then another piece that you touched on was just the sort of compassion of the doctors and nursing staff, and sort of different treatment of people as humans, and not sort of another case to be checked off the list,
Mhm.
which I think is really an interesting way to think about it. And it kind of speaks to the importance of the care aspect of care. And I think one issue that we we come up against in the US is a sort of desire to be efficient and, keep people as medically safe as possible, or in other words, keep them from dying, but not necessarily with the highest quality of life or enriching their life so that the life they're living is actually worthwhile and the way they want to live it. And there's really this tension in so many care facilities, I think, around this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, additional thoughts on that aspect.
Interesting, because I think, as you know, and as a number of folks probably kind of have a hunch about, elder care in America is incredibly regulated. And that's not a bad thing, but I do think that that prevents some of the humanness that is available in other places. And when something is so regulated, I think that it becomes a little bit difficult to move outside of the checklist and into sort of eye contact and sort of regular interaction. So I think that that's sort of a foundation of probably why some of those things that you mentioned exist. And, I don't try to paint care migration as a total Garden of Eden, because there are things to consider. And I'm not saying that it is unregulated, but it does have a little bit less regulation. At least it tends to, which, are just things to consider. And yeah, I think it's just important for people to know the differences.
Yeah, and it sort of stems out of both this cultural approach to care and elders, but also, as you mentioned, the legal structures in place that kind of, as you say, I think doctors in the US live in a little bit of fear of lawsuits and
Mm,
so there's sort of like, I just need to do what I need to do, and that's it.
absolutely.
I at one point summed up the differences between the care that my dad experienced in the US and Mexico as Mexico being sort of more warmth and less consent. But,
Yeah.
you know, because there's a lot more of like touching or like, oh, you need something, I'm just going to like help move you or pick you up. Whereas in the US, somebody will stop and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Is that okay?
Mm,
But there's less warmth to it, it's
yeah.
just technical.
And it takes some getting used to, and really that's why I'm here, is to try to help people at least understand that if they are considering something like that, care migration, because you're right there. And with your dad and with mine, there have been instances of saying, hey, this is a little bit different, at least, of this nurse is just
Hmm.
kind of coming in and making things happen when they're, I think, a lot
Manhandling
of
me a little
times.
bit.
Yeah, when
Yeah,
people are used to, more of a structure, so to speak. So, yeah.
absolutely. Well, let's get into some of the like maybe downsides or some of the other differences. I mean, they don't have to be downsides, but what other considerations do people have when they think about themselves or their family members moving abroad, aside from the environment and the type of care? I mean, you mentioned finances. That's obviously one.
The first one that comes to mind just naturally, and the one that I've experienced talking with families, is moving a loved one away. Folks, it's comfortable and it's nice to have your loved one close, whether that's a facility in town or in-home care, if that's possible. So that's usually the first real sort of, I guess, negative consideration, is that, a loved one's going to be farther away. I do like to sort of paint the picture to people that if your loved one is quite close by, let's just say in a facility that's in town, and let's just say you go and visit them 2 times a week for a couple of hours, or some relative schedule like that, there's still a lot of time that they are in care without you there that I think is subpar comparatively to sort of the intention that you can be had in Mexico. And you're so financially in the green with the option of care migration that I like to say, well, if it's possible for you, then you can go down to Mexico for, a week, a month, for example, and get relatively the same amount of time with your loved one, but all the time that you're spending away, whether that's in the same town or in a care migration setting, the care that's being received when you are away, I'm more comfortable with where my dad is now than if he was in, Minnesota. I would be a little bit more worried when I'm not there compared to now. And then to, further expand on the question, it's also a language change, but there's a lot to say about that. I think that especially these places that are expat, you know, even though I'm not as we've talked about, a huge fan of that word, I would really say kind of American or Canadian immigrants. They are usually in places where English is very quite common. So a lot of these sort of concerns tend to get a little bit blown out of proportion, especially with news cycles and just sort of things that people hear, and we can chat more about all of that. But those are just a few things that happen kind of right off the bat.
Great. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the financial piece, John? Because I know that this kind of came up earlier in the conversation, but we haven't really dug into it deeply. And I know that's a big consideration for people and that maybe that's changing. So, can you talk a little bit about what people are asking you, considering when it comes to the potentially more affordable care they can access abroad?
Yeah, this is big. So I'll give just a little bit of sort of my personal experience, and then also kind of answer that a bit broadly. For my dad in Minnesota, for memory level care, he was paying about 14,000 a month, 14,500 a month for care. And again, ratios of around eight residents to one caregiver during the day, and 12 or 13 residents to one caregiver at night. And in Mexico, currently as we speak, he has 24-hour one-on-one care, which is
Oh,
the Rolls Royce of elder care, with English-speaking caregivers, and out the door for all of his care, a lovely, room that kind of overlooks the lake, and all the meals and all of his medications and everything that he would need, just completely out the door, is about $4,700 a month, but he still gets his Social Security. So, basically a third of the difference. And that's just kind of in Minnesota, that example. But if you're in, New York or California, especially at kind of a, let's just say more of a luxury facility, it's not uncommon for that number to go 15, 20, 25,000 a month.
yeah. My mom pays, I would say, or well, before she went on Medicaid, she had to go on
Yeah.
Medicaid. That's another story, but
Mm-hmm. Yep.
15,000 a month just for nursing care. That was not
Yeah.
memory care. And memory care, as we
Yeah.
know, is usually substantially more expensive. But we're in Seattle, so it's
Yep.
an expensive city, but still, that's one-on-one is
And
amazing.
yeah, it really is. And, not everybody needs that, of course, but with that option, at least, comes fall risk just kind of, falls off a cliff. I'm not saying that people won't fall. I think it's just kind of in the nature of getting old, but and without needing 24-hour one-on-one care, that cost would likely go down to about $2,500 or $3,000 a month. And then, as you mentioned, sort of the Medicaid, Medicare aspect, especially as we're speaking now, and it's when all of that is changing, is really a big reason why people have started to, I think, more seriously consider what we're talking about. Is that, let's just say 10 years ago plus, or even, 5 years ago, is, you would look at your assets and spend down your assets to under $3,000 total, and then you would theoretically qualify for Medicaid. But that sort of blanket reality is not necessarily the case anymore. And even before you get to that step, having to work your whole life, have a nest egg, have a home, and then have to consider selling all of that is I don't think it was really the intention of people, and it's a sad reality to try to dwindle down or spend down your assets. And when I speak with, executive directors or people in just sort of the general landscape of elder care in the US, they sort of say, spend down your assets as it's like, something that's just easy or the thing to do. Whereas in sort of the care migration reality, you can hopefully keep a lot of your assets, and that ideally passes on to your family, which I think is the goal in the first place. And so yeah, it's a really advantageous way, and a big point of this whole thing obviously is much better financial realities for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Medicaid piece, and, of course, as I mentioned, I have experience with this, but it also just, in addition to being able to hold on to your assets, I'm grateful that my mom is in a good facility with Medicaid coverage, but a lot of people are not able to find care that's covered by Medicaid. Definitely not high quality institutions. I mean, my mom got into a nonprofit run high quality facility, but many people end up in care homes that are of wide variety of quality, let's just
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
And, you kind of have to take what you can get when you get in that position. And so I think there's just also a degree of personal choice and autonomy that gets removed there. You sort of have to
Mhm.
settle with what you can get. And then, of course, now we're facing this situation where Medicaid is on the chopping block and is looking at significantly less funding, and more requirements in homes shutting down in the US because in anticipation of losing all of this funding, because 60% of people in nursing homes are on Medicaid. And so if nursing homes expect to not be able to have that funding, or they're going to close, they can't stay in business. So it's really, it's a situation that I feel like we're potentially going to see a lot more people looking for other options, potentially outside of the country.
And to touch just a little bit more on sort of the specifics of finances, the term out of pocket, I think, naturally scares a lot of Americans, as it should. But just to give a specific situation, is that in Mexico, when you go and see let's just say a specialist or a primary care physician, that hour-and-a-half long visit with a neurologist tends to be about $60. And there is, and we can get into the whole insurance aspects of all of this, but there is emergency care, emergency level insurance options. I tend to try to work with specialists in that field, even though I know sort of blanket information. But for medications and for doctor's visits, that does tend to be out of pocket in Mexico, but it is very, very reasonable, which is quite surprising to folks as they're used to, basically having insurance cover something or it's a disaster in America.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine paying only $60 for any
Yeah.
kind of doctor
Yeah.
appointment. I mean, not even close. That would be hundreds of dollars.
Mm,
Sometimes even the out-of-pocket share is hundreds of dollars,
yeah.
depending on your insurance. So, yeah, it really is wildly different. So, yeah, it's a big consideration for a lot of people, I think, and I'm interested to see, how that changes as the funding decreases in this country. And speaking of, I would just love to ask you if you have seen what you've seen in your business. So I know it's, kind of anecdotal in your early stage in your work in this area, but can you tell us a little bit about like who's coming to you, how you're finding your clients, and if you're seeing any what feels like more talk or inquiry around this kind of option?
Yeah. So far, it's actually been surprising to me who's been contacting me, because I thought that it would be sort of hyper focused in a region, whether that's sort of cold weather. So, I was born in Minnesota, and I been kind of doing a lot of just speaking with my general network about it, and actually that's how a lot of my business has started is just word of mouth, because everybody that you talk to has some connection point that's going through elder care. But what surprised me is actually a number of folks from, Arizona and California have actually reached out, and I think that that's because they are just a little bit more comfortable with sort of, just culturally having Latin people sort of around day to day. And I think that making the migration is just a little bit easier for them to consider. But also people in northern states, it tends to really be sort of the classic sort of snowbird talk where, they don't want to really be stuck inside of a facility or even at their home when it's just, a tundra outside for many
Yeah.
months. And so it's really all over the board. And yeah, I've spoken with, just a large handful of folks and trying to help them consider. But I do agree. I think that over time, especially in the shorter periods, it's going to increase a lot. Yeah, very happy to speak with people on the phone at the start, lay out all of these different sort of pillars and questions that they might have. And then again, whether it's wanting to come with the person that would need care or just with, a family member that's considering it for a loved one if they want to come and meet in Mexico or Panama, but mostly Mexico. I'm very happy to do that.
That's great. Yeah, I know my stepdad, my dad's husband had somebody who was already in Chapala who was able to really help navigate the system and connect him and take him around and help find an apartment. And that's, I think critical. How do you go about doing this if you you don't have help and you don't have
Yeah.
contacts in the region and you don't really know what you're doing? So I think that's just a really valuable service for people and for families. I'm curious at what point people contact you. Is it usually the families of a loved one who has gotten to a point where they just really need much more substantial care, or they have a neurodegenerative disease, as you mentioned, or is it individuals themselves saying, I want to plan for my own
Mm.
future? How does that work?
Yeah, good question. Mostly it actually is a family member that's kind of starting to plan for their loved ones and their older members of their family. And I hope that people try to give it as much attention before an emergency as possible, but that's not the reality that I think a lot of us in this industry are seeing. I do think, unfortunately, that a lot of those decisions happen really kind of in an emergency situation, and I think that that's why a lot of folks tend to have to make sort of a rash or, quick decision with, very high costs associated with it, because they don't, all of a sudden, somebody's living sort of independently by themselves and a fall happens or another event occurs, and maybe they're not in a situation where they can care and house for that person, and so they they're in a facility a week later, for example. But I, especially considering another place like Mexico, does really help to. I think that a higher success rate of comfort in an option like that does tend to come from spending time there beforehand and not just try to, make it all happen when it's needed, but more so it's kind of in your mind, and you're considering it, before it's really needed, for example.
The best decisions don't happen under intense
Yeah,
pressure.
yeah,
Right. Yeah, I completely agree, although I think that's when it usually happens. I mean, people don't
yeah,
wanna think too much about things going downhill, right?
yep, yep.
And then falls, as you say, tend to be really the trigger. I mean, that's what it was for my dad, and in many cases, that's what it is.
And I
But I
and I
completely agree. I'm on this, like, get help sooner rather than later, like,
yeah.
make plans, and nobody wants to do it, but I think it's really important.
And I will just say that, if you are in an emergency situation and you do reach out to me, it's not a bad thing. It happens to a lot of people where there's something that's, significant happening, and I'm very willing to help you along the way in that. And really a huge benefit, which we mentioned before, is the relative affordability of 24-hour one-on-one care options, which doesn't even need to be, the whole time, but it could be, in a crisis situation, you could, elect to have that for, let's just say, a month in Mexico and not already have a massive bill attached to that. If somebody is able to travel, for example, it's quite, I don't want to say easy, but it is able to be implemented quickly, where if somebody's there, I have now enough access to different, facilities and in-home care nurses and, all sorts of things to implement things with.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good to know because we can't, we can plan as much as we want, but at the same time, we can't predict everything.
Absolutely.
And often that's just the way it works and that things happen under pressure in a
Yeah,
crisis.
definitely.
And I don't know if I asked you this before, but I know you're focused on Mexico. Are there other countries that you're working in?
I know Mexico the best just because of my personal situation with my family, and I do know the ins and outs of that as we speak now the best. But I am very interested in Panama, mostly just because of the similar foundations that I've found in Mexico, while it's access to really good healthcare and hospitals, on the same time zone, relatively easy to get to. And that's actually one of the reasons why I have not explored, let's just say Portugal, for example, is that, the different time zones and sort of the effort for a family member to get there is a barrier to entry that I've sort of said no to so far. But Mexico is the primary at the moment, and Panama I'm considering also. It's quite, stable. They
Uh-huh.
use the US dollar, for example, and the visa pillar of all of this is quite attractive in Panama.
That's great. And what about Ecuador? Have you done any? I've heard of Ecuador as being a possible location for
I have.
care.
I've also heard of that. I haven't really done enough to advocate for that. And I will also just briefly say that, at this point you can find a considerable amount of information of all of these places online for elder care, but I strongly suggest, to whether it's with me or not with me, to go see it yourself, because there are facilities that I've seen that kind of sound good on an article, and you get there and you wouldn't want your loved one there, and that happens not only in Mexico but all around the world. So I just think as a blanket statement in care, it's good to go see and feel and smell and, and see, make eye contact with the people that are going to be actually providing the care. So all of that is really important, and that's why I feel confident in doing that for Mexico, and I'm starting to get there for Panama, but I have not done that for Ecuador yet.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to have the
Mm,
full sensory experience
yeah.
before you move somebody there. Let's see. Yeah, I guess I just want to leave it now open to you to add that you'd like to add to the conversation, anything we missed, anything people should know about, if they're thinking about migrating for care or looking into this option, what would you tell them?
Well, I think that when you don't um, really know all of the options to consider, this one can be daunting. You don't really know where to start. You know, moving away seems a little bit hectic. What about the language? Is it safe? All of these things, and those things can be handled together one by one. And I think that when people really give it a good look, sort of at the end of all of that effort and consideration, I think is something that truly is better care that allows people to preserve assets, which, I think is just going to become more and more important. And yeah, I just think it's very beneficial for people to at least consider, even if they don't end up going with that option. I think a lot of folks that I've seen just in general feel like they don't really have a place to turn, that, an event occurs and all there is to do is just sort of go into a facility that's sort of nearby your home. And I just want folks to know that that's not the only thing to consider. There is better options that translate to options for 24-hour one-on-one care at, the cost of nearly a social security check, that allows people to conserve their nest egg and sit in the sun and eat better food and save their money while doing it.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good advice. I think in the care industry overall, we need more people who play this caring role of helping families, supporting people through transitions, and really serving as an advocate for the patient's best interest, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak today. I know that this is going to be helpful for so many people out there, and hopefully, some people will feel empowered to reach out to you as they think about these options for themselves or their loved ones. So, until next time, thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that we're both interested in sort of an out of the box option. And yeah, the business is Eldercare Global. Eldercareglobal.com is the website. And yeah, call or email, and we'll speak soon. Thank you so much for the time.
Great. Thank you.